This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph was sold by his brothers. Now his fathers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, and I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. And they say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cisterns. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on a sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard.
Well, thank you, Danny, and again, welcome to Long Hill Chapel. And we are so glad that you're here. If you are a guest this morning, a special warm welcome to you. Thanks for coming out and checking out church with us on this beautiful, beautiful day. We've been in a series called Still Standing. And one of the things I love about my wife is that she is the most amazing cook ever. She's the best. And some of you are like, "No, I know someone who's the best." No, my wife is the best. I'm not even going to argue that fact. But we as a family are blessed by her love of cooking and her skill at cooking. When we first got married a quarter century ago, we were in a very different phase, as many newlyweds are, living in an apartment down in Sterling, New Jersey. And we discovered a love for Indian food. And we kind of tripped into that. There's a place over in Madison by the Staples. It's still there. And that's where I kind of fell into that. And it just became the thing we always wanted to eat. And we had some friends who actually were part of Long Hill Chapel at the time who were very well off, and they had an apartment in the city. And we went to visit them this one time on Park Avenue. You can kind of get the sense of that. And somehow it came out that we really liked Indian food. And the wife, she said, say no more, and got like 5 taxis and taxied us down to 57th Street around 2nd and 3rd Avenue. And there was an Indian restaurant there that completely blew our minds. They had this whole menu. They brought everything out. And some of you hate Indian food, and you're like, no, I'm not going to do that. I promise you, you would find something here. You know, if there's something besides Jesus that I want to convince you of, it is this. And we just were, our minds were blown, but because we were poor newlyweds who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Sterling, New Jersey, that was not a regular option for us when it came to Indian food. And so my wife got the cookbook from this restaurant, and she took it upon herself to learn how to be a really good Indian cook, and she is. And so we're blessed by that. But the thing with Indian, like if you're going to do it well, yeah, you can go get some spices off the shelf, but what you need to do is you need to roast your own. And so she would do all these things just to make a single dish. She'd crush and roast the spices, but then she would have to prepare the meat, and she'd have to prepare the sauce and the rice and the lentils and the bread and all these other things that went with it. And it was really not just like a recipe. It was multiple recipes within one recipe. And as I watched her do that, it just reminded me of the fact that there's these times in our lives where we feel like we're getting towards the end of something, and then there's this whole other thing. We're getting towards the end of making the thing, and then there's another thing that has to happen. And it's something we can all relate to, that we get through something and we get around the corner, and then we discover that maybe we're actually further away than we thought. And today we're in this series called Still Standing, and it's really a series about one thing. It's about endurance. And over the summer, we've been looking at how this plays out in the scriptures, but more than just these kind of moral stories and moral lessons, how God works redemptively when we follow him, and the things that we can learn about how he works in people and how he works in us. You heard today a part of the story of an Old Testament character named Joseph in the book of Genesis, and there's kind of this line of generations of the same family that are chronicled in Genesis, and this is a long story. We heard one piece of it in Genesis chapter 37, but it goes on for about 12 or 13 chapters. It finally wraps up somewhere around Genesis chapter 50. And when we hear this word endurance, this is something we all want. This is something you want. This is something I want. When we see circumstances in front of us, we're like, I want the power and the endurance and the strength and the perspective to persevere. And so we want it in our world. I want it in my world. You want it in your world. What's interesting about the story of Joseph is that it's actually like 5 different stories. It's not just one story, it's a whole bunch of different stories. And for the purposes of our time together, instead of reading all 12 chapters all the way up to 50, and we're here and it's through lunch and it's a beautiful day and you all want to go home, is I'm going to summarize this a little bit, and because I'm a preacher, I'm going to make the sections rhyme. Is it okay if I make the sections rhyme? We like that. So there's this first section of the story that we just heard, and I'm calling that the positioning. And so Joseph has these dreams, and then he goes and he tells his brothers about the dreams, and it's not really subtle that they're like, okay, you all are going to bow down to me. I'm going to be the one that's the special one. You're all going to do that. And his brothers, they kind of put 2 and 2 together. He started out because his father already favors him. He's made him this coat of many colors. There's a Broadway musical about all of that. But he comes in and he says that, and it's just this really entitled, spoiled, immature way of looking at the story. And that sets up the second story. So there's the positioning. And by the way, these dreams are from God. These dreams are from God. They are a foretaste, they're a herald of how Joseph's life is going to play out. But the way he interacts with that positioning is not the right way. But God still uses it. The second part of the story is the pit. So we have the positioning, we have the pit. So Joseph's brothers are pretty ticked about this. There's this rift that's opened up in between them, and he comes down to find where they're tending the herds, and they find him and they throw him into a pit, and as you heard, they sell him to some Ishmaelites who take him in the opposite direction of his home into slavery in Egypt. You know what? My kids have some moments where they get in fights with each other. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, everyone's boys do that. Mine definitely do that. We've been on vacation the past week and a half. That has been the dominant theme of our time together. Like, I'll leave them anonymous, but older ones stay away from the younger one. You don't have to say anything. You don't have, put your hands back over there. It's just been ongoing. But never has one of my kids tried to sell the other one into slavery in Egypt. That hasn't happened. So some of you, you're like, I don't know if I'm a good parent. I don't know if I'm a bad parent. As long as your kids are not trying to sell the other kids into slavery, you're doing great. So have courage, take heart, because there's no one throwing people in pits and selling them into slavery. But that sets up the second story. And so Joseph is taken captive and he's sold into slavery in Egypt. And that takes us to the third part of the story, which I'm calling Potiphar, because it's about this guy named Potiphar who was the captain of the guard, Pharaoh's guard in Egypt, a very powerful, influential man. And he's the one who actually buys Joseph as a household slave. And Joseph does this thing. He starts to rise in stature. He takes on responsibility. God's favor is on him. It actually says that in the text. And this seems like the payoff from all the other stories. It's like, he got thrown into the pit. He got taken into slavery in Egypt. It was a bad time. This is like the redemptive arc of the story. And you're like, it worked out. God salvaged this thing. He got glory from this thing. He redeemed this thing. His favor was always on Joseph. And I think what happens with us is most of us have one of those arcs in our life, where there was a good time, there was a not good time, and then there was a time where it kind of all made sense again. What happens in this story is something completely different. And that sets up the fourth story of Joseph, the prison. Basically what happens is Joseph gets propositioned by Potiphar's wife. He flees, he doesn't want any part of it, and she kind of pins the story on him. That he had tried to approach her, that he had tried to do all those things. And Potiphar throws Joseph into prison. So suddenly the story starts here, it goes down here, it comes back up here, and then it seems like it goes back down here. But again, the scriptures tell us something. That even in prison, God's favor was on Joseph. Even in this difficult, dark place that didn't seem like it fit with the narrative, God's favor was on Joseph. And let me just sidebar this for a second. Some of you feel this. You feel like you're in this place that you don't want to be, that you don't think you deserve to be, that you wish you weren't. God still sees you. And his favor is still upon you. And the same thing happens in the prison. Joseph rises to prominence. It's discovered that he can interpret dreams. He's placed over all the other prisoners. It's just kind of the same story as happened in Potiphar's house, except now it's in a prison. This is a reminder to you and I that regardless of where God takes us, regardless of where you find yourself, the calling, the positioning, the thing that we saw all the way back in the first story, it still applies. And sometimes what we do is we mistake our circumstances for whether God sees us with favor or not. And I think what the scriptures tell us here is that regardless of our circumstances, God is with you. If you acknowledge him, if you recognize him, that's the thing we see Joseph do over and over again as he acknowledges and recognizes God for who he is, that God's favor is with you. And it's not about where you are, it's about how you've been positioned where you are. It's not about where you are, it's about how God has positioned you where you are. And this, if we hold on to this, friends, this changes how we see the circumstances of our lives. It changes how we see difficult seasons and moments and obstacles and all of the things that God has still put his calling on you. He's still positioned you. That promise is still true even when you're in those difficult places. And so the story goes on. There's these two guys, a baker and a cupbearer, who are in the jail, and they have these weird dreams. And remember, Joseph knows a thing or two about dreams. He had some way back in the beginning. And Joseph interprets the dreams, and one of them is like a really good interpretation. It's like, I had this dream. What's it mean? And it's like, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh's house. The cupbearer gets his position back. And the baker is like, cool, this sounds great. What's my dream mean? And Joseph interprets that too, and it's not nearly as happy. Joseph says in 3 days he's going to impale you on a spike. So not the interpretation of the dream that you want. And these things come to pass. What happens next in the story, though, it's this little phrase that we miss very often in Genesis chapter 41. It seems like, okay, there's this thing, he's risen to prominence. He has these two encounters with these two officials. The cupbearer who's restored to Pharaoh says, you know what, I'm not going to forget that you did this thing. And when I'm back with Pharaoh, I'm going to tell him about it. And so Joseph is hanging on to hope. The things, just like they have before, the story was up, the story was down, the story is up, the story is down. It looks like the story is going back up. And it says in Genesis chapter 41 and verse 1 that 2 years pass. 2 years. Not a week, not a couple weeks, not a month, 2 years. And I can only imagine the things that Joseph felt in that 2-year period of time. Did I miss it? Is God really with me? Is this how this is going to end? With me in prison, wrongly accused, not seeing how God is at work at all. But God's favor was with Joseph. Pharaoh, he has some dreams too. And he's like, nobody knows how to interpret these. He asks his religious officials, his advisors, nobody can figure out what the dreams mean. And that's the moment where the cupbearer remembers this guy named Joseph, 2 years later, in the prison. And Joseph comes and he interprets the dreams, and really the short version is that there's going to be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph says, it's time to get ready. It's time to prepare. It's time to take the blessing of now and put it into savings for the future when we're going to need it. And Pharaoh says, you know what? You seem like the kind of guy who should oversee this effort. And so Joseph goes from the prison to the palace. And so events play out. There's 7 years of plenty. Famine strikes. It strikes in Egypt, but Egypt has food. And the surrounding areas become aware that this is the case. You know, the word gets out that there's food in Egypt. And of all people, Joseph's brothers go to Egypt looking for food, and they re-encounter Joseph in this very different season of his life. And like the dreams in the first story, they find themselves bowing down to Joseph. And so those dreams, way back in story number 1, they come true. Suddenly the tables are turned. It's not the brothers throwing Joseph into the pit. It's Joseph holding all of the cards. In that moment, and we'll come back to this, Joseph's response is different than many of our responses would be. So what's a life like this? 5 stories, up, down, mountaintop, valley, mountaintop. Teach us about endurance. It's this. Endurance isn't something we find in the moment. It's something that we build over a lifetime. It's not something we find just to get around the next corner. It's something that we build, and I'd say more correctly, God builds in us if we embrace all of the things that he's doing. You know, we think endurance is like just this thing we need for a specific situation. It's something we need to get around the next corner. I remember, like, when I was in 7th grade, we had this thing where we'd have to run a mile. And I was not a runner at that point in my life. And all the kids in 7th grade went out to the track, and they had to run a mile. It didn't matter if they'd run. It didn't matter what their physical fitness was like. Some of the kids just killed it. Some of the kids barely made it. But it's something, I remember this very clearly. Maybe I'm a little traumatized still, that you need an endurance just to get those 4 times around the track, to stay running, to not stop, to not give up, to not throw up, and to get over the finish line. And I think we all know what endurance looks like in that kind of a situation where we need something and we just need enough of it to get over the finish line. But I think it shows us a little bit more than this. Joseph's story shows us more than this. Joseph's first story, it sets up the second story, and the second story sets up the third story, and the third story sets up the fourth, and it's just this journey up and down where just when it seems like the endurance has paid off, there's another season that takes more endurance. And it's only in that last moment, only in the palace, that everything seems like it clicks. Here's the thing we need to remember, not only about this story, but about our lives. We need to hold on to. Sometimes we need to hold on to it through tears. Sometimes we need to hold on to it when nothing else makes sense, with the last ounce of strength that we have, that God uses it all. God was there in it all. God is even showing us, and I know this is hard for us to grasp, some of us, where we are right now. God is even showing favor to us in it all. Now, we've already in the series, we've talked about this, but there's this thing that happens in those valleys that builds something in us that isn't built any other way. The scriptures talk about this over and over again, from the very beginning to the very end of the scriptures. There's something that is produced in us that we need, not only to get through the valley, but to properly understand what we are supposed to do on the mountain. Look at the comparison between Joseph. In his first season, he has this positioning, this calling from God, where it's a dream, and God gives it to him, and it's like, there's these things, I'm going to be placed over other people. And he does what any other immature person would do. He says, yeah, I love this one. God has plans to prosper me and not to harm me, to give me hope and a future. We love that verse. But then the way he works it out is not a healthy way. I think a lot of us, I can certainly relate to this in my own life, in my own journey of life. And so Joseph positions himself above other people. But look at that last season. Look at that last mountaintop. What does Joseph do? He uses his positioning to serve other people, even his brothers who were trying to kill him. He uses the place that he has not to get revenge, not even to seek justice, because that would have been due him. But he uses it differently. How did he know how to do that? It was because of what he learned in the valleys. And you and I go through life, and we may not have that situation. As I said, you may not have been sold into slavery in Egypt or thrown into a pit or anything like that. But we have versions of that in our stories, versions of that with other people that represent those things in our lives. And when we come back to a place of influence, when we come back to a place of power or prominence, it is so easy for us to look at that and say, this is what God has given me to give me justice. And it might even be something that we deserve. But what Joseph does here is different. Endurance is found when you embrace your positioning in any story or season as being from God. It's when you embrace the positioning you have, whether you're up here, whether you're down here, whether you rinse and repeat, whether you do it again, where it seems like it's going up and down, wherever you are, you embrace that positioning. Now, I'm not saying that you should say all my circumstances, even the bad ones, are actually good. Even when bad stuff happens to me, that's good. You know, we do that sometimes. If you're a Christian, you try to do that and you say, there's these bad things. Somehow they must be good. There's just something I'm missing here. There are things that are just bad. There's suffering, there's violence, there's abuse, there's oppression. There's things you've experienced that are just not good. And it's okay to come before the Lord and lament those things and say, God, what is going on? I know I'm a broken person in a broken, fallen world, but what in the world did I ever do to deserve this? Many of you have something like that you're carrying, that has written a chapter of your story in your past. And it's not to say, well, that was actually good. No, that was bad. But God can get good even out of those things. He can rescue, He can snatch, He can redeem good, and He has still positioned you in that story, just like Joseph was positioned in his story. And if you hold on to that, whether you're down here, whether you're up here, whether you're somewhere in between, whether you're in the mountain or in the valley, you can continue to walk faithfully. And you can hold on to the promise that God will be faithful to you. But at the same time, He's going to build something in you. I think it's really key that Joseph acknowledges God in every single season. Up here, down here. And I know for us, it's easy to acknowledge God in the bright seasons. You know, when we're on the stage, it's like all the people do at the Grammys or the Oscars. They thank God and they thank their producer. It's easy to do that in those moments because you're seeing the payoff. You're seeing why it was worth it. You're seeing how it all worked. It would have been easy for Joseph to see those dreams and say, yeah, I like this one. Or when he was in the palace, or when he was in Potiphar's house. It would have been easy for Joseph to acknowledge God. But what about the pit? What about the prison? Where was God in that? You know, today, some of you, you don't feel the positioning. You don't feel Potiphar's house. You don't feel the palace in your own story. You're in that long middle where you started with something you thought was from God, and now you're down here, and now you're trying to figure it all out. Here's something I'm still working through. So I say this as a fellow traveler on the journey of life. When you and I trust our perception of how things are supposed to work, how they affect us, we often miss God. When we say, you know, there's this thing that's going on, and I don't like how it's affecting me, that can be true, but if that's the central lens through which you look at your life and you look at your circumstances, you will probably miss God. What if, instead, you and I made the repeated daily decision, even in difficulty, even through tears, to trust that even when we can't see Him, God is still at work. I've told this story before. I've had a couple kids. Many of you have had kids. You know, my wife Grace, I remember when our older son Christopher was born, 11 years. He's going into middle school. I can't believe that he's doing that. It's been 11 years. But I remember when she was pregnant with him. If you've seen Grace, Grace is not as tall as I am. And Christopher was a gigantic baby. And so, you know, we have this little woman, gigantic baby, like, gigantic baby. And she was talking to one of my relatives, and they were like, yeah, Hoddy babies end up pretty big. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, Grace. And so she was it was in the summer. My son's birthday just passed last week. And she was getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more uncomfortable and more uncomfortable and more uncomfortable. What if she didn't know what was going on? What if she didn't know how that story was supposed to end? That would have been the most disconcerting, complicated, scary thing ever. But she knew that her season of suffering led somewhere. It led to us holding our first child and all of the joy that comes with that. And you may be in a season where you don't know the ending. But what if you trusted God that He is the one who is writing it? He's faithful. He gives you favor even in the bottom of the valley. And He's not done yet. So friends, hold on to, look back at His faithfulness and hold on to His promises. Because when you endure, God can redeem the worst things and He multiplies the best. When you endure, when you hold on, when you keep going, when you hold on to God, when you pray to God every day, give me the strength wherever I find myself. You recognize God as God when you're up here and when you're down here. He redeems the worst and He multiplies the best. At the end of Joseph's story, this long story, or these stories of Joseph, there's this last scene. Joseph's dad and his brother's dad, Israel, his name is, he was Jacob, and he was renamed Israel, has died. And the brothers at this point are really worried. They're worried that the only reason Joseph hasn't lowered the boom on them is because his dad is still alive and he wanted to honor his father. And they're worried now that Joseph is going to come and settle the score. But look at how Joseph responds to them. This is Genesis chapter 15, verses 19 and 20. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." Listen to this. This is important. Am I in the place of God? If he was in the place of God, he would be the central character. But if God is God and He is trusting and He's submitting and He's acknowledging and He's receiving the things that are growing perseverance and endurance in Him, it changes His perspective. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. There's this worship song we sing, and I appreciate the sentiment of it very much. And it says this, it's kind of a paraphrase of this verse. It says, "You took what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good." That is true. God does that. But what if that's not just for us? What if that's not just God taking the bad things that were done to us and somehow getting good out of them for us? What if it's for more than that? Look at how Joseph phrases this. He says, God intended it for good. For me? Oh, there was a lot of good Joseph received in this season, but it was for more than me. It was for the saving of many lives. Joseph was written into this story for a bigger purpose. Because if this was primarily about him, justice would have seemed like a good reason. Or him just holding a lot of the cards for the rest of his life. For him having the power and the authority to redeem from the time where he didn't have any of those things. But it's different because he has the perspective, because of what has been grown in him and developed in him in the valleys. And friends, when you're in the valley, you can know that even though it's not a place that anyone would want to be, that God is still at work and He's building something in you that when you're on the mountain, it will give you the proper perspective for how to live. When God redeems things, when God redeems us, He doesn't just redeem them for us, He redeems us for others. So when God redeems, it's not just for us, He does that, but He redeems us for others. This is the truth of the gospel. This is what Jesus does. He comes to save us, and most of us like that part, and we get that part, and most of you in this room, you know you've done that, and if you haven't, you ought to. Receive Jesus as your Savior and your Lord. But that's not it. That's not the end of the story. He's redeemed you to give you back to the world, to give you back to this community, to give your gifts and your talents and your experience and your passion and your energy, to pour those things out in the lives of other people, just like He Himself was poured out for us. Because that's what the gospel is. You know, when our ends don't make sense, when how we think it plays out doesn't make sense, it is easy for us, it's easy for me to lose heart. But if you can begin to see that God is up to something greater, that is the thing that will cause endurance to rise in you. Some of you, you're a single parent today. And you've poured yourself out and you sacrificed yourself, and the vision that you had for your life is nothing like what you've received in your life. It's not what you wanted. It's not the dream that you thought you had, and you keep doing it over and over again. Some of you, you're caring for a spouse, and when you stood across from that person on their wedding day and you said, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part, you never knew it was going to look like this. You never knew that this was where it was going to end. You never knew that this was the season that you were going to find yourself in. Some of you have been praying and praying and praying and praying and praying for years, for a son or for a daughter. You've been praying that a relationship would be restored. You've been praying that an addiction would be overcome. You've been praying and you've been praying and you've been up and you've been down, and there's been moments where it seems like victory and there's been moments where it seems like defeat. And you're wondering whether it's all worth it or not. None of these things that you've been doing would make sense if this story was about you. None of these things would make any sense for you to keep doing if this story was about you. And if we have the proper eyes to see what God is up to, when we're in the pit, it is the thing that gives us the perspective that the story was never all about us. Certainly, we play an important part. Your faithfulness matters. God hears your prayers. God sees your struggles. God sees the tears. He sees the moments where you're like, where are you, God? What if God is still writing that story? What if he's the main character? What if the legacy and the impact is something that he's working out? What if he is as at work in the pit and in the prison as he is in the positioning and in the palace? Can you trust him? Can you trust that? As we close today, you think your life is one story, it's about one thing, but what if it's a series of seasons? I just pray that God would show you himself to you today, even if you're in the pit, even if it feels like you're in the prison. Keep trusting. Keep hanging on. Friends, this is what we do for each other. This is why we bear each other's burdens. Because there's some of you who are in this room today, you're watching online today, who you're at your last straw. You're at your last ounce of strength. I pray that God would speak to you today. I pray that God would speak to you through someone today who reminds you of who he is. Maybe today you're not that. Maybe you're in the palace. You see a vision of where God's leading you. Hold on to that too. But realize that where God has placed you, what he's given you, what he's doing in you isn't even primarily about you. It's for others. You've been redeemed. Your story has been redeemed, but you are redeemed to be poured out, just like Jesus was in the world around us. And hold on to the fact that God is always at work in the positioning, in the pit, in the prison, and in the palace. Would you pray with me? God, by the power of your Spirit, you know where everybody in this room is. You know on that hill, on the bottom, on the top, you know where their story is, where their circumstances are. What they look around behind them and see, and what they look ahead of them and they see. And some of us come into this place with weariness, with great trepidation. Some of us with hope, with expectancy. Thank you for that. But I pray that you would remind us of who you are, that you still show us favor regardless of where we're positioned. And because of what you're building in us, the endurance you're giving us, we can take the next step. I pray that you would remind us each of that today. I pray in Jesus' name.